Hello, and welcome to Train Signal. I'm Don Jones, and this is the Creating Stored Procedures lesson in the Database Administration Fundamentals course. In this lesson, we'll talk about SQL Server stored procedures, including the purpose of stored procedures, how to create stored procedures in the graphical user interface, and how to create them by using the data definition language. I'll show you how to execute a stored procedure and try and help you understand the dangers of SQL injection attacks. A stored procedure is basically a batch file or a script that tells SQL Server to execute a given set of commands in a specified order. Stored procedures execute within SQL Server itself, and they're a good way to modularize specific processes and procedures. Stored procedures can accept input, and they can produce output, although they don't have to do either. They execute entirely on the server, and here's the benefit of that. Let's say you have some complex business logic or rules that have to be implemented whenever changes are made to your database. You could implement that information in a client application so that the application just knows to never even execute any queries that don't meet the rules. And that's kind of a good idea because the client application can do things like display visual cues and error messages to a user who's about to try and do the wrong thing. However, any changes you need to make to that logic have to be made to the client application, which then has to be deployed to all of your users. Stored procedures, on the other hand, are centralized. By having those rules executed on the server, you sort of set up a gateway or a firewall so that bad data can never make it into the database, even if someone is running an outdated version of your client application. Using stored procedures can reduce the processing requirements for your client applications, although they do increase the workload on the server because it's doing more of the processing. Stored procedures offer convenience. They give you the ability to bundle sometimes complicated business logic into a single, easy-to-use command. They also provide a layer of security by preventing access to the underlying data and instead only allowing interaction through the procedures, which can implement their own logic to make sure that only the proper changes are made. Stored procedures offer centralization. By putting functional code on SQL Server, where it's more easily updated, you don't have to worry about redistributing updated client code all of the time. Stored procedures can also offer a performance benefit because SQL Server can cache or keep or store the execution plan for a procedure, enabling it to rerun that procedure in the future with a bit less overhead. There's a second performance benefit too, because it allows you to enforce best practices by disallowing direct queries. So rather than having client applications constantly banging away with direct queries and hitting your data, you force them to use the procedures that you've written, and that way you can be sure that queries are running with the best possible performance plan. Now, SQL Server Management Studio does provide a GUI for creating stored procedures, although it's not as elegant or as helpful as the GUI used to produce views and tables. Basically, you're still just typing code into a window. But it's worth taking a look at, so let's hop over to SQL Server Management Studio and see how to create a stored procedure in the GUI. We'll use our test database to briefly create a stored procedure. I'll go under Programmability. I have a folder for stored procedures. Right-click, New Stored Procedure. This is really just tossing me into DDL land, and the stuff to look at here, let's scroll down just a bit, is this. This is actually creating the stored procedure. So I can create a procedure. We'll just call it my procedure for right now. I can add whatever input parameters I want. Let's say I don't want to add any. And here's where I actually execute the query. So we'll just do something very simple and say select star from people, which is one of the tables that I have in here. So really this stored procedure isn't doing anything I couldn't do myself, and in fact I might even want to do with a view, but you can get extremely complicated. We're not really here to cover all the different things a stored procedure can do or to dive into its sometimes complicated syntax, just to kind of show you what's going on. So if I execute this, command completed successfully. Let's refresh this folder. And there's my procedure. Most people tend to prefer creating stored procedures by using DDL, and it actually applies very little overhead beyond the code in the procedure itself. Any database administrator or DBA with just a little bit of experience under their belt usually will use DDL instead of the GUI, and really, as you'll see, there's not much of a difference. We'll use a new query window in SQL Server Management Studio to create a new stored procedure by using DDL. Of course, now you know that the secret of creating a stored procedure in the GUI is that you're really not using the GUI at all. It all happens in a query analyzer window, mainly because stored procedures are really just a bunch of instructions typed out. A graphical builder of some kind wouldn't really make a lot of sense. Now, if you really need to see the DDL for an existing stored procedure, it's pretty easy. Right-click, script the stored procedure as a create command to a new editor window. And this will show you the command that's actually inside here, and if you needed to carry this over to another computer and execute it, you could. One thing I think is neat is that once you're in this command window and you can see the DDL directly, you can click just a portion of it. In other words, here I've just selected the command that the stored procedure is actually going to run. Right-click, execute, and it'll just run that command. So I can run pieces of the stored procedure one step at a time if I need to, and it gives me a way just to test it a little bit, see what it does, maybe troubleshoot it if I'm having some problems with it. But ultimately, creating a stored procedure is always a DDL task. Even if you use the GUI to do right-click new stored procedure, you're ultimately still creating a stored procedure in DDL. Executing stored procedures is pretty straightforward. You simply use the exec command and the name of your stored procedure. You then follow that with a comma-separated list of any input parameters that the stored procedure might require. If a procedure returns results as a table and it doesn't require any input parameters, well, then you can treat it as a table. Select star from, and then the procedure name would select all of the information from it. It's far more common and standardized to use the exec command to actually run a stored procedure. Whenever you dynamically construct a query based on user input, you open yourself up to a kind of attack called SQL injection. The attacker essentially provides input that modifies the SQL query to display data that you normally would not display, such as sensitive information, to modify data, or even to delete data. Stored procedures can help avoid SQL injection because user input that's provided to the stored procedure via input parameters is automatically sequestered and not dynamically treated as part of the query itself. For example, let's say that we have some program code that uses the variable x to display or store the contents of some user input. Now let's say a malicious user came along and instead of typing a username or a password or a customer name or whatever input you expected them to type, they type something like this, which looks like a portion of a SQL query. Internally, you're utilizing that variable x as part of a query. Select star from table where x. That then expands out to look like select star from table where x equals x. Oh, well, that's always true. And where name in, delete from a table name. This would actually delete everything from that table. And it's a very simplistic example of how SQL injection is often used. Good ways to avoid SQL injection is to use stored procedures and to properly escape and analyze user input for known forms of SQL injection attack. Most importantly, never trust user input. Get paranoid. Assume that everything someone types into a client application or a web page is going to be used against you. In this lesson, we covered the basic purposes of stored procedures, and I showed you how to create a stored procedure in the GUI and in DDL, and honestly, the two methods aren't all that different from one another, are they? I also showed you how to execute a stored procedure and tried to help you understand the basics of SQL injection attacks and how to avoid them.